Crickstel had worked as a security guard at the Galactic Union's diplomatic station for 40 cycles, and he believed he had seen everything the universe could throw at him. He had watched Ravnian warlords cry like babies when they signed peace treaties, and he had seen silicon-based aliens try to have romantic relationships with the station's computer systems, and he had once spent 3 hours talking a hive queen out of eating an entire group of diplomats. His 4 legs were strong, and his exoskeleton was thick, and his combat training was the best in the sector, and nothing scared him anymore. Or so he thought, until the human arrived. Her name was Maya Chun, and she was small even by human standards, with dark hair that she kept tied back and eyes that seemed to notice everything around her, and a smile that made no sense to Crickstel, because she smiled at everything, including things that should terrify any sensible creature. She was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien life forms, and she had been assigned to what the station called the rehabilitation wing. Crickstel hated the rehabilitation wing. The rehabilitation wing was where they kept the Kethrani cubs, and the Kethrani were the most dangerous predators in the known galaxy, and even thinking about them made his heart beat faster. The Kethrani came from a death world that made Earth look like a vacation resort, and they had 8 legs tipped with razor-sharp claws, and they had compound eyes that could see in complete darkness, and they had mandibles that could cut through military-grade armor like it was soft fruit. The adults had been responsible for the massacre at Outpost Stigma 7, where they killed over 2,000 people in a single night. And the images from that attack still gave Crickstel nightmares. The 3 cubs in the rehabilitation wing were orphans, and their parents had been killed in the military response to Sigma 7, and someone high up in the Galactic Union had decided that killing children was wrong, even if those children were monsters, so they kept the cubs in maximum security containment with energy shields and reinforced walls and automated feeding systems, because no living person was stupid enough to enter that habitat. Armed guards watched the cubs through cameras at all times, and everyone agreed that when the cubs grew up, they would have to be moved to a prison planet, because they could never be safe around other species. Then Maya Chun read the cubs' files and asked Station Commander Volkith a question that made Crickstel's mandibles drop open in shock. She asked why the cubs were so sad. Commander Volkith was a tall insectoid creature with more combat medals than anyone on the station, and he had fought in 12 wars, and he had never once shown fear. But when Maya asked that question, he looked at her like she had grown a second head. The cubs were not sad, he explained slowly, as if talking to a very small and very stupid child. They were calculating, and they were waiting, and they were watching for weakness, and they were predators who would kill anything that entered their space. Maya had listened politely, and then she had smiled that strange soft human smile, and she had requested habitat access. Crickstel was in the room when this happened, and he actually laughed out loud, because surely this tiny human was joking. She was not joking. Commander Volkith refused immediately, and he explained that entering the Kethrani habitat without military escort and pulse shields was suicide, and he would not authorize anyone to throw their life away. Maya had nodded and thanked him for his time and left his office. 3 days later, she submitted a formal request through the Galactic Union's Scientific Research Division, citing 17 different regulations about the ethical treatment of juvenile specimens and the importance of socialization in developing neural pathways, and a lot of other scientific words that Crickstel did not understand. The request was approved over Commander Volkith's very loud objections. Crickstel was assigned to monitor the security feeds when Maya first entered the habitat, and he was told to keep his claw on the emergency termination switch, which would flood the habitat with poison gas if the cubs attacked. He watched Maya walk through the airlock doors carrying nothing but a warm blanket and a small bag, and wearing no armor and carrying no weapons. The 3 cubs were waiting for her. They were each about the size of a large earth dog, and their black exoskeletons gleamed under the artificial lights, and their many eyes tracked their every movement, and their claws clicked against the floor as they spread out to surround her Krextal's. Claw tightened on the termination switch, and his heart pounded in his chest, and he was certain he was about to watch a human Maya walk to the center of the habitat and sat down on the floor. She wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and reached into her bag and pulled out some orange sticks that she would later tell him were called carrots, and she began to eat them slowly and calmly. She did not look at the cubs, and she did not speak to them, and she did not show any sign that she knew they were there. The largest cub approached her first, and its mandibles clicked in the pattern that usually came right before a killing strike, and Krextal's claw pressed harder on the switch. Maya took another bite of her carrot. The cub circled her once, and then twice, and then 3 times, and its siblings watched from the edges of the room, and the only sounds were the clicking of claws and the crunching of carrots. Then the largest cub lay down beside Maya, not to attack and not to prepare for a strike, but simply to rest. Krextal stared at the screen and could not believe what he was seeing. Over the next hour, the other 2 cubs approached, and they sniffed at Maya, and they touched her blanket with their claws, and eventually they lay down too. By the time Maya left the habitat 4 hours later, all 3 cubs were sleeping in a pile around her, and she had to gently move them aside to stand up. She looked up at the security camera and smiled and gave a small wave. Krextal did not know what to write in his report. He eventually settled on writing that the human had successfully established initial contact with the Kathrani specimens, and that no termination had been required. It was the most confusing day of his 40 cycle career, and it was only the beginning. Maya returned to the Kathrani habitat every single day for the next 3 weeks, and every single day Krextal watched her through the security feeds with his claw hovering over the termination switch. He never had to press it. The cubs seemed to understand that Maya was not prey, and they never tried to hurt her, and instead they began to wait for her at the airlock doors every morning, like pets waiting for their owner to come home. Krextal found this disturbing on a level he could not fully explain. He had studied Kathrani behavior during his combat training, and he knew that they were pack hunters who worked together to bring down prey much larger than themselves, and he knew that they showed no mercy and felt no affection and cared only about survival and dominance. But the cubs acted differently around Maya. They followed her around the habitat, and they brought her things like shiny rocks and bits of metal from their bedding, and they made soft clicking sounds when she spoke to them, even though she was speaking in a language they could not possibly understand. On the 4th day, Maya brought toys she had made them herself from spare parts she found around the station, and they were simple things like balls made of wrapped cloth and sticks tied together with string, and something she called a puzzle box, which was a container with treats inside that the cubs had to figure out how to open. The cubs went crazy for the toys. They chased the balls around the habitat, and they fought over the sticks, and they spent hours trying to open the puzzle boxes, and when they finally succeeded, they made sounds that Krextal had never heard a Kathrani make before. They sounded almost happy. By the end of the 2nd week, Maya started naming them. She called the largest one Pepper because she said he had a spicy personality, and he was always the first to investigate new things, and he was not afraid of anything. She called the middle one Sage because she said he was calm and thoughtful, and he always watched before he acted, and he seemed to think about things more than his siblings. She called the smallest one Rosemary because she said Rosemary was delicate but strong, and she was the most curious of the 3, and she always wanted to know what Maya was doing. Krextal thought the names were ridiculous. He mentioned this to Maya one day when she was leaving the habitat, and she laughed and told him they were herbs from Earth, and that herbs seemed sharp and dangerous at first, but they made everything better once you got to know them. He did not understand what herbs had to do with apex predators, but he did not argue. By the 3rd week, something changed. Maya requested permission to take the cubs outside the habitat for short walks around the station's empty corridors during off hours. When no one else would be around, Commander Volkith nearly had a heart attack when he received this request. He called Maya into his office, and Crickstill was there. As security and the commander spent 20 minutes explaining all the ways this could go wrong. The Cubs could escape and kill civilians, and they could damage station systems, and they could cause a diplomatic incident that would end careers and possibly start wars. Maya listened to all of this, and then she said something that Crickstill would remember for the rest of his life. She said that the Cubs were children, and that children needed to explore and learn and grow, and that keeping them locked in one room forever would only make them more dangerous, not less. She said that fear created monsters, but love created family. Commander Volkith stared at her for a long time, and then he rubbed his face with his upper appendages, and he looked at Crickstill and asked if humans were always this crazy. Crickstill said yes. The commander approved the request with so many conditions and restrictions that the approval document was longer than most peace treaties. Maya did not seem to mind. The first walk happened at 3 in the morning station time, when the corridors were empty, and Crickstill followed at a safe distance with his weapon drawn and his hearts racing. Maya walked slowly down the corridor, and the 3 Cubs walked behind her in a perfect line, and they looked around at everything with their many eyes, and they clicked at each other in what sounded like excitement. When they reached an observation window that looked out at the stars, all 3 Cubs stopped and stared. They had never seen stars before. They had been born in captivity after their parents were killed, and they had spent their entire short lives in a habitat with artificial lights and metal walls, and they had never known that the universe was so big and so beautiful. Rosemary pressed her face against the glass and made a sound that Crickstill had definitely never heard. A Kathrani make it was a sound of wonder. Maya knelt down beside her and pointed at different stars and constellations, and she told the Cubs stories about the places out there in the darkness and the adventures waiting for them if they grew up strong and good. The Cubs listened like she was telling them the secrets of the universe. Crickstill lowered his weapon slightly and watched this tiny human surrounded by 3 of the most dangerous creatures in the galaxy, and he felt something strange in his chest. It took him a while to recognize the feeling as hope. After that night, the walks became regular, and the Cubs became calmer and more curious and less like the killing machines their species was known for. Other security guards started watching the feeds, and word spread around the station about the crazy human and her pet monsters, as some people thought Maya was insane, and some people thought she was brave, and some people thought she was going to get everyone killed, but everyone agreed that something impossible was happening in the rehabilitation wing. The Cubs were changing, and nobody knew what that meant for the future. 6 standard weeks after Maya-chan first entered the Kathrani habitat, Crickstill experienced the moment that would make him famous throughout the entire Galactic Union. It happened on an ordinary morning during his regular patrol of Sector 7G, which was usually quiet and boring, and gave him time to think about what he would eat for lunch. He was walking down a long corridor that led to the observation deck, and he was thinking about the spiced meat rolls from the cafeteria when he turned a corner and his legs stopped working. His brain sent the command to move, but his legs refused to obey because his legs had decided that moving would get him killed. 3 Kathrani Cubs were walking down the corridor toward him. They were loose, and they were free, and there were no energy shields between them and him, and his weapon was still in his holster, and he knew he could never draw it fast enough. His combat training screamed at him to fight, and his survival instinct screamed at him to run. And his logical mind simply informed him that he was about to die. Then he noticed Maya-chan. She was walking in front of the Cubs with a datapad in one hand and a steaming container in the other, and she was humming a tune that Crickstill did not recognize. And she seemed completely unconcerned that she was leading 3 apex predators through a space station full of potential victims. The Cubs walked behind her in a perfect triangle formation, and their many legs clicked softly against the floor, and Their compound eyes were fixed entirely on the small human in front of them. They moved when she moved, and they stopped when she stopped, and they adjusted their pace to match hers exactly. They were following her like baby birds, following their mother Maya. Looked up and saw Crystal frozen in the corridor, and she smiled brightly and waved her datapad at him. She said good morning and told him not to worry because the cubs had already eaten breakfast, and they were just going to watch the nebula because Rosemary had never seen a Stella nursery before. Crystal could not respond because his voice had stopped working along with his legs. The smallest cub broke formation and approached him, and Crystal felt his heart stop beating for a moment. Rosemary sniffed at his leg and then made a sound that he had never heard any Kethrani make in his entire career. She was purring. The sound was soft and rhythmic, and it vibrated through the air like a song, and it was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Crystal had ever heard. Maya laughed and told Rosemary to stop scaring the nice security guard, and she called the cub back to formation, and Rosemary immediately returned to her place behind Maya. They walked past Crystal and continued down the corridor, and he watched them go with his mandibles hanging open and his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. He stood frozen for another 5 minutes before his legs finally started working again. His security report that day was very short. He wrote that humans had done something impossible again, and that he had no explanation for what he had witnessed, and that perhaps the universe was stranger than anyone had ever imagined. The incident did not stay secret for long. Someone had been watching through a maintenance camera, and they had recorded the whole thing. And within hours, the video was spreading through the station's internal network. People watched the footage of the tiny human leading 3 deadly predators like pets, and they could not believe their eyes. Scientists requested access to study the cubs and their behavior, and psychologists wanted to interview Maya about her methods, and journalists from across the sector sent requests for statements. Commander Volkith was not happy about any of this attention. He called a meeting with Maya and Crystal and several other senior officers, and he demanded to know how the cubs had gotten loose. Maya explained calmly that they were not loose, but that she had received permission to expand their walking area, and that the cubs were perfectly safe as long as they were with her. The commander asked what would happen if they were not with her. Maya thought about this for a moment, and then she said something that made everyone in the room very uncomfortable. She said that the cubs would probably go looking for her. She explained that Kethrani cubs in the wild stayed with their parents until they were old enough to hunt on their own, and that the cubs had imprinted on her as their parent figure, and that they would follow her anywhere and protect her from any threat. A military officer asked if this meant the cubs would attack anyone who threatened Maya. Maya said yes. She said it like this was a completely normal and acceptable thing and not absolutely terrifying. Crystal watched the faces around the room, and he saw fear and confusion and disbelief, and he realized that none of them understood what they were really dealing with. They saw the cubs as weapons that Maya had somehow tamed, and they saw potential military applications and diplomatic advantages, but Crystal had seen the way the cubs looked at Maya. They did not see her as a master or a handler or a trainer. They saw her as their mother, and anyone who had ever met a Kethrani knew that they would die before they let anyone hurt their family. Meeting ended with no clear decisions, and the commander told everyone to keep the situation quiet while they figured out what to do, but the video kept spreading, and soon people from other stations and other worlds were talking about the human who had taught monsters to purr. Crystal started getting messages from old friends asking if the stories were true. He told them yes, and he told them that he had seen it with his own eyes, and he told them the humans were the strangest species in the galaxy. He also started spending more time near the observation deck in the mornings. He told himself it was just part of his patrol route, but the truth was that he wanted to see Maya and the cubs again. He wanted to understand how she had done the impossible. He wanted to believe that maybe the universe was not as dark and dangerous as he had always thought, and every morning he watched Maya-chan walk past with her 3 deadly children following behind her like ducklings, and every morning he felt that strange feeling in his chest. It was definitely hope, and it was growing stronger every day. The attack came 3 months after Maya first entered the Kethrani habitat, and it came without warning, and it came with violence that reminded everyone why the Kethrani were the most feared species in the galaxy. Crystal was in the security command center when the alarms started screaming, and red lights flooded every corridor, and automated announcements told everyone to evacuate to safe zones. Immediately, a Kethrani raiding party had breached the station's outer hall in Sector 12. They were adults, and there were at least 20 of them, and they were looking for their stolen children. Crick still felt his blood turn cold when he heard this, because he knew exactly which children they meant. Kethrani moved through the station like death itself, and they carved through security teams and blast doors and everything else in their path, and within the first 10 minutes, they had killed 37 people. Crick still coordinated evacuation efforts and directed security forces and tried to slow the Kethrani advance, but nothing worked. These were not cubs learning to trust a human. These were adult warriors who had survived on a death world and killed thousands of people, and they would not stop until they found what they were looking. 4 reports flooded in from across the station, and Crick still tracked the Kethrani movement and realized with horror that they were heading straight for the rehabilitation wing. They were following the scent of their young. He grabbed his communicator and tried to contact Maya-chan, and he prayed to every god he knew that she was in a safe zone. She did not answer. He checked the safe zone registers, and her name was not on any of them. He checked the security feeds, and what he saw made him run faster than he had ever run in his life. Maya was not in the safe zone. She was in the corridor outside the rehabilitation wing, and the 3 cubs were with her, and they were not running away from the danger. They were waiting for it. Crickstal sprinted through corridors filled with panicking civilians and past security teams, heading the wrong direction, and he pushed his old legs harder than they had moved in 20 cycles. He found Maya standing in the middle of the corridor with Pepper and Sage and Rosemary pressed against her legs. The cubs had changed. Their razor claws were fully extended, and their hunting plates had risen along their spines, and their mandibles were spread wide, and they were making a sound that Crickstall had only heard in combat recordings. They were making the Kethrani War cry, but they were not crying for blood. They were crying in defense. Maya stood perfectly still with one hand resting on Pepper's head, and her face was calm, but her eyes were watching the far end of the corridor where shadows were moving. Crickstall raised his weapon and moved to stand beside her, and he asked her what she was doing and why she was not hiding. Maya said that she could not hide. She said that if she hid, the cubs would tear apart. Anyone who tried to get between them and her and innocent people would die. She said that this was the only way to protect every young. Crickstall wanted to argue, but he did not have time because the adult Kethrani had arrived. They came around the corner like a nightmare made real, and their black exoskeletons gleamed with the blood of the people they had killed, and their many eyes locked onto Maya and the cubs. There were 6 of them in this group, and the largest was a scarred female who had to be at least 3 times the size of Pepper, and she had killed more people than Crickstall could count. The scarred female stopped when she saw the cubs. The other adults stopped behind her. For a moment nothing moved, and no one made a sound, and the only noise was the distant wail of the emergency alarms. Then the scarred female made a complex series of clicking sounds, and Crickstall did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was confused. She was asking a question. Maya clicked back. At her, Crickstall stared at Maya in shock because he had not known that she had learned to speak Kethrani, and he wondered how long she had been practicing and why she had never mentioned it. The scarred female clicked again, and this time her posture changed to something that looked almost like uncertainty. Maya spoke quietly without taking her eyes off the adult. Kathranishi said that the scarred female was the cub's birth mother. She said that the female was asking why her children smelled like prey and why they stood with meat instead of hunting it. Krikstal raised his weapon higher and told Maya to get behind him. Maya said no. She stepped forward and placed herself directly between the security forces and the Kathrani as she spoke to the cubs in a gentle voice. She said their names one by one, and she told them to go to the scarred female. She said it was okay. She said the female was their family. The cubs did not move. Pepper growled deep in his throat and pressed closer to Maya, and Sage stepped forward to put himself between Maya and the adults, and Rosemary made the purring sound, but it sounded different now. It sounded defiant. The scarred female went completely still, and Krikstal had fought Kathrani for years, and he had never, ever seen an adult go still like that. Something was happening that the adult did not understand, something impossible. Maya knelt down so she was at eye level with the cubs, and she spoke to them softly, and Krikstal could barely hear what she said. She told them that it was okay to have two families. She told them that they could love their birth mother and love her too. She told them that love was not something that ran out and that having more family only made you stronger. She told them to go and show their mother who they had become. Pepper hesitated for a long moment, and then he touched his head to Maya's forehead in a gesture that looked almost like a kiss. Then he walked toward the scarred female. Sage followed, and then Rosemary, and they walked with their heads high and their claws retracted, and they showed no fear and no submission when they reached their birth mother. They did not crouch or cower. They stood tall, and they made the purring sound. The scarred female looked at her children, and then she looked at Maya-chan, and something changed in her many eyes. She made a sound that Krikstal had never heard any Kathrani make before. The translation came later from linguistic experts who studied the recording for weeks. The sound meant something close to teacher, or perhaps it meant miracle. The scarred female turned and clicked commands to the other adults, and one by one they lowered their claws and retracted their hunting plates. The attack was over. Maya-chan had stopped a Kathrani raiding party, not with weapons or shields or military force. She had stopped them with love, and nothing in the galaxy would ever be the same. One standard year after the attack on the station, Krikstal stood at the main observation deck and watched a sight that would have seemed impossible. When he first started his security career, Kathrani ships were arriving at the station, but they were not coming to attack. They were coming to negotiate peace. The Treaty of Station Kethral 7 was about to be signed, and representatives from across the Galactic Union had gathered to witness the historic moment, and journalists from 100 worlds were broadcasting live feeds to billions of viewers. Krikstal was no longer a simple security guard. He had been promoted to head of interspecies security after his actions during the attack and after his detailed reports about Maya-chan's methods. With the Cubs, his reports had been read by admirals and scientists and diplomats, and everyone wanted to understand how one small human had changed everything. Still was not sure he understood it himself. The diplomatic platform at the center of the observation deck was filled with important people from important species, and they all wore their finest clothes and their most serious expressions, but everyone kept looking at the same spot. They kept looking at Maya-chan. She was no longer called a xenobiologist. Nah, she was Ambassador Chun, and she wore the formal robes of the Galactic Union's diplomatic corps, and she stood at the center of the platform with a calm smile on her face, and standing around her in a protective formation were 3 fully grown Kathrani warriors. Pepper had grown to nearly twice his cub size, and his exoskeleton had darkened to pure black, and his claws could cut through starship armor. Sage had developed the distinctive markings of a Kathrani strategist, and his compound eyes seemed to see everything and miss nothing. Rosemary had grown beautiful in the strange way that predators could be beautiful, and she moved with a grace that made other species shiver. They were Maya's honor guard, and they never left her side, and they watched everyone around her with eyes that promised violence to anyone who meant her harm. Other species looked at the massive predators flanking the tiny human, and their faces showed terror and disbelief and confusion. But Crickstal just smiled. He had seen this coming for a year now, and he was no longer surprised by anything humans could do. The ceremony began, and speeches were made and documents were signed, and history was written in careful words about peace and cooperation and new beginnings. But Crickstal knew that the real history had been written a year ago in a habitat room, when a small human sat down with a blanket and some carrots and refused to be afraid. The Kethrani delegation was led by the scarred female who had attacked the station, and her name was revealed to be Kethra, and she was not just any warrior, she was the war mother of the largest Kethrani clan. She had killed more people than any other Kethrani alive, and she had led raids that destroyed entire colonies, and she had been the most wanted criminal in the Galactic Union for 20 cycles. Now, she stood beside Maya Chun, and she called Maya the teacher of cubs, and she treated her with more respect than she showed to any other being in the universe. The treaty they signed was not just a peace agreement, it was a new way of living. The Kethrani agreed to stop raiding and to join the Galactic Union as members instead of enemies, and in exchange the Union agreed to help the Kethrani find new ways to feed their people and raise their young. And at the center of this agreement was a new program based on Maya's methods. Human volunteers would go to Kethrani worlds and help raise the next generation of cubs using patience and toys and love instead of violence and fear. Some people thought this was insane. Some people thought it would never work. But Crickstal had watched Maya turn 3 killing machines into purring children who did puzzles and watched stars and protected their human mother with everything they had. He believed anything was possible now. After the ceremony ended and the diplomats went to their fancy parties, Crickstal found a quiet moment to approach Ambassador Chun. He had a question that had been bothering him for an entire year, and he needed to know the answer. He asked her how she had done. I'd asked how she had known that the cubs would not kill her on that first day. He asked what made her walk into that habitat with nothing but a blanket and snacks. Maya thought about the question for a long time. Then she said that she had not known. She said that she had been terrified every single time she entered that habitat for the first 3 weeks. She said that her hands had shaken and her heart had pounded, and she had wanted to run away more than she had ever wanted anything in her life. But she had looked at those cubs, and she had seen children, scared children who had lost their parents and been locked in a cage by creatures they did not understand. She said that where she came from there was an old saying that the best way to defeat an enemy was to make them your friend. She said that humans had been doing this for thousands of years with every dangerous creature on their planet. They had taken wolves and made them into dogs, and they had taken wildcats and made them into pets, and they had found the most dangerous things in their world, and they had loved them until those things loved them back. It was what humans did. It was who humans were. Crickstal listened to this, and he thought about everything he had seen over the past year. He thought about cubs learning to purr and warriors laying down their claws and enemies becoming family. He thought about how the entire galaxy had been changed by one small human who refused to be afraid. A young Valorian cadet approached them, and the cadet was staring at Pepper and Sage and Rosemary with wide, terrified eyes. The cadet asked Crickstal how Maya had tamed the deadliest predators in the known galaxy. Crickstal considered the question carefully. Then he said that she had not tamed them. He said that she had loved them. He said that humans found the most dangerous things in the universe, and they loved those things until they loved humans back. The cadet's mandibles clicked in confusion, and the cadet said that was insane. Crickstal watched Maya laugh at something Pepper had said, and he watched Sage gently adjust her ceremonial sash with claws designed for killing, and he watched Rosemary growled protectively at a diplomat who'd stepped too close to their mother. He thought about wolves becoming dogs and monsters, becoming children and enemies, becoming the most loyal family anyone could ask for. Yes, he agreed with the cadet. It was absolutely insane. That was what made humans so terrifying. That was what made humans so wonderful. And as he watched Maya Chun walk away with her 3 deadly children following behind her like ducklings, Crick still felt that feeling in his chest. One more time, it was hope, and thanks to the humans it was spreading across the entire galaxy, one impossible miracle at a time.